When most people think about Skyrim, they think about vast wilderness, lonely roads, and remote settlements separated by miles of mountains and forests. And for the most part, that's true. But there are a handful of places that feel completely different. Locations where people seem packed into every corner, where dozens of NPCs live, work, gather, and move through the same small area every single day. Cities bustling with activity, crowded hubs filled with merchants and travellers, and settlements that somehow manage to hold far more people than their size would realistically suggest. These are the places where Skyrim feels the most alive, the locations where conversations overlap, schedules constantly intersect, and you're never more than a few steps away from another character going about their daily routine. Compared to Skyrim's countless isolated caves, villages, and wilderness camps, these places almost feel crowded. And in a world known for its emptiness and harsh landscape, that makes them stand out immediately. The Grey Quarter is one of the most densely populated and socially concentrated areas in all of Skyrim. And what makes it so fascinating under the theme of overpopulated places isn't simply the number of NPCs living there. It's how many people have been forced into such a small space. Unlike the bustling markets of Whiterun or the wealthy districts of Solitude, the Grey Quarter wasn't designed to be crowded. It became crowded through circumstance. Refugees, workers, families, merchants, and displaced Dunmer all ended up occupying the same few streets within Windhelm's walls, creating one of the most packed and socially tense communities in the entire province. The result is an area that often feels far busier than its physical size should realistically allow. The moment players enter the Grey Quarter, the atmosphere immediately feels different from the rest of Windhelm. The city itself is already densely arranged by Skyrim's standards. Ancient stone buildings rise close together. Narrow pathways weave between homes and businesses. The harsh northern climate encourages people to stay close to one another. But the Grey Quarter amplifies that feeling drastically. Every building seems occupied, every corner contains residents, every street feels lived in. And because the district is relatively small compared to the rest of the city, that population density becomes impossible to ignore. What makes the Grey Quarter particularly interesting is that its population isn't the result of prosperity. Most crowded places in Skyrim are crowded because they attract people. Markets attract merchants, capitals attract nobles, trade centres attract travellers. The Grey Quarter attracts almost nobody voluntarily. Instead, many of its residents ended up here because they had nowhere else to go. After the eruption of Red Mountain devastated Morrowind, countless Dunmer fled their homeland. Windhelm became one of the primary destinations for refugees crossing into Skyrim. Over time, those refugees settled into a single district, creating a concentrated community that would eventually become known as the Grey Quarter. That history is visible everywhere. Unlike many neighbourhoods in Skyrim that feel loosely populated, the Grey Quarter constantly gives the impression that space is limited. Multiple families share close quarters, businesses operate alongside residences. Workers, merchants, and refugees all occupy the same confined area. The district feels full, not in a celebratory sense, in a practical one. Like every available building has been put to use. That feeling becomes especially noticeable when compared to other parts of Windhelm. Wealthier residents occupy larger homes elsewhere in the city. Government officials have access to more space. Even some merchants enjoy significantly better living conditions. Meanwhile, the Grey Quarter feels compressed. A large population squeezed into a relatively small section of the city. That compression contributes heavily to the district's identity. The streets never feel empty, even though Skyrim's technical limitations restrict how many NPCs can physically appear at once. The dialogue, schedules, and environmental storytelling all imply a population much larger than what players directly see. Everyone seems connected to everyone else. Everyone seems aware of everyone else's business, and everyone occupies the same handful of streets. The social dynamics of the district reinforce this perception constantly. Because so many residents share similar circumstances, interactions occur frequently. Conversations about discrimination, employment, housing, and survival happen throughout the neighbourhood. Unlike isolated villages where NPCs often operate independently, the Grey Quarter feels like a community forced into close proximity. People can't avoid one another. Their lives overlap too much. That overlap creates the sensation of density far more effectively than raw population numbers ever could. The marketplace contributes significantly as well. While the Grey Quarter doesn't contain a grand central market comparable to other cities, commercial activity remains concentrated within a small area. Businesses serve both local residents and outside customers, creating additional traffic through an already crowded district. Merchants live near customers, customers live near workers, and workers live near families. Everything exists within walking distance, and because of that, the district often feels busier than larger sections of the city. The architecture itself plays a major role in amplifying this feeling. Windhelm's ancient Nordic design creates enclosed spaces throughout the city. Stone walls limit expansion, buildings sit close together, streets remain relatively narrow. Within the Grey Quarter, those design choices create an almost claustrophobic atmosphere. The neighbourhood feels enclosed from every direction. Residents aren't simply living together, they're living on top of one another. That physical closeness mirrors the social closeness created by shared circumstances. Compared to other overpopulated areas in Skyrim, the Grey Quarter stands out because its density feels unplanned. Cities like Solitude and Whiterun were built to function as population centres. Their layouts support commerce, governance, and movement. The Grey Quarter, however, feels improvised, a district forced to absorb more people than it was ever intended to accommodate. And that creates a very different atmosphere. The overcrowding doesn't feel efficient, it feels necessary. That distinction matters because it changes how players experience the location. Instead of viewing the district as a thriving urban centre, they see it as a place constantly struggling to make room for everyone living there. The new Genesis Corner Club illustrates this perfectly. The establishment functions as the gathering place, an inn, a social hub, and cultural centre all at once. Multiple roles overlap within the single building because the community lacks the space to separate them. That pattern repeats throughout the district. Buildings serve multiple purposes, residents share limited resources, space becomes valuable. And the result is one of the most densely utilised areas in Skyrim. The Grey Quarter's population also feels larger because its residents are unusually memorable. Many districts throughout Skyrim contain NPCs who blend into the background. The Grey Quarter's inhabitants tend to stand out because they participate directly in the social tensions defining the area. Players remember them, they remember their stories, they remember their struggles. And because those characters leave strong impressions, the district itself feels more populated than it technically is. A neighbourhood filled with memorable individuals naturally seems larger than one filled with forgettable faces. The contrast with nearby areas further enhances this effect. Outside the Grey Quarter, parts of Windhelm can feel surprisingly sparse. Large stone structures dominate sections of the city. Open courtyards and wider pathways create breathing room. Then players enter the Grey Quarter and everything changes. Buildings crowd together, conversations become more frequent, residents appear around every corner. The district immediately feels busier, almost crowded. That contrast makes the neighbourhood's population density even more noticeable. Even at night, the area rarely feels truly empty. Residents return home, businesses close, and activity decreases. But the district still maintains a sense of occupation. Lights remain visible through windows, NPC schedules continue overlapping. The neighbourhood feels inhabited in a way many Skyrim locations don't. You never get the impression that people are spread out. You get the impression they're packed together. That's ultimately what defines the Grey Quarter as one of Skyrim's most overpopulated places. Not because it contains the largest number of NPCs, not because it serves as the biggest city, but because every aspect of the district emphasises concentration. People concentrated into limited space. businesses concentrated also into that space, and communities also integrated into the same space as everything else. The neighbourhood constantly feels full, and that fullness shapes everything about its identity. Compared to isolated villages like Kynes Grove or Skull Village, the difference is dramatic. Those settlements are defined by emptiness and distance. The Grey Quarter is defined by proximity. Nobody lives far away. Nobody has much room. Everyone exists together within the same compact environment. The result is a district that feels larger than it is, busier than it is, and more populated than its actual size would suggest. A place where hundreds of stories seem compressed into a handful of streets. A neighbourhood carrying the weight of an entire refugee community. And one of the clearest examples in Skyrim of what happens when too many people are forced to share too little space. Markarth is one of the most overpopulated feeling places in all of Skyrim, not necessarily because it has the largest population, but because of the way that population is forced to exist within the city's unique geography. Unlike Whiterun, which spreads outward across open ground, or Solitude, which benefits from wider streets and large public spaces, Markarth is built directly into an ancient Dwemer ruin carved into the walls of a narrow canyon. Every home, marketplace, workshop, guard post, and government building is compressed into a vertical maze of stone terraces and stairways. The result is a city that constantly feels crowded, even when relatively few people are physically present. Everywhere you go, there are signs that the city's population is competing for the same limited space, creating one of the most densely packed urban environments in Skyrim. The moment players first enter Markarth, the city's layout immediately creates a sense of compression. Unlike most settlements in Skyrim, which reveal themselves gradually as you move through the streets and plazas, Markarth surrounds you almost instantly. Massive stone walls rise on every side, buildings are embedded directly into cliffs, staircases climb upward in every direction, water channels cut through the city, leaving even less usable space available for expansion. The city doesn't feel like it was built, it feels like it was squeezed into existence. And that's what gives Markarth its distinctive atmosphere. The population isn't simply living together, they're stacked on top of one another. That verticality changes everything about how the city feels. In most Skyrim settlements, people spread horizontally. Homes sit beside other homes, businesses line roads, public spaces provide breathing room between different parts of the city. Markarth rarely offers that luxury. Instead, every district seems layered directly above another district. Houses overlook marketplaces, noble estates overlook worker housing. Temples sit above commercial areas, guards patrol stairways, connecting dozens of different levels together. The city never feels open, it feels compressed, like every available surface has been converted into living space. That sense of density becomes even stronger when you consider Markarth's history. Unlike many other cities that expanded gradually over time, Markarth inherited much of its structure from the Dwemer civilization that occupied the region long before the events of Skyrim. The city's layout wasn't designed around the needs of modern Nords. It was adapted from ancient ruins built for entirely different purposes. As a result, many parts of Markarth feel awkwardly repurposed. Residential areas occupy spaces that don't necessarily resemble traditional neighbourhoods. Businesses operate from structures never intended to serve as shops. Government functions are squeezed into old Dwemer architecture. Everything feels constrained by the limitations of the environment. And when a population is forced to adapt to limited space, overcrowding becomes inevitable. The marketplace provides one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. Most major cities in Skyrim feature market districts designed to handle significant amounts of traffic. Whiterun's market occupies a relatively open central area. Solitude benefits from wider streets and larger gathering spaces. Markarth's market exists within a comparatively confined section of the city. Merchants, customers, guards, and travellers all funnel through the same limited area. Because the surrounding terrain prevents expansion, commercial activity becomes concentrated into a narrow space. The result is a market that often feels far busier than its actual population would suggest. Everyone is forced together. Everyone occupies the same pathways. Everyone shares the same limited room. That concentration creates the illusion of a much larger population. The city's staircases contribute heavily to this feeling as well. Stairways dominate Markarth's design. Almost every destination requires moving vertically rather than horizontally. Residents constantly travel between levels, crossing paths repeatedly throughout the day. This creates a sense of continuous movement, even when the city's population remains relatively small by modern standards. The constant flow of people up and down the stone pathways makes the city feel alive. And this activity often translates into perceived population density. The more often players encounter NPCs, the more crowded a location feels. Markarth takes advantage of that effect constantly. Its design funnels people together repeatedly. You rarely walk far without passing someone. Another factor contributing to Markarth's overpopulated atmosphere is the sharp contrast between social classes living in close proximity. Wealthy citizens occupy prominent positions higher within the city, while labourers, miners, merchants, and the poorer residents occupy lower sections. Despite these differences, everyone remains confined within the same canyon. Unlike sprawling cities where social classes can spread across separate districts, Markarth compresses everyone into a relatively small footprint. The wealthy can't move far away, the poor can't move away either. Everyone remains part of the same vertical ecosystem. That creates a constant sense that the city is operating at maximum capacity. There simply isn't much room for separation. The surrounding environment also reinforces this perception. Most Skyrim cities possess natural opportunities for expansion. Open plains, forests, and surrounding terrain provide room for growth. Markarth has almost none of that. The canyon walls define strict limits on development. Mountains surround the city. Sheer stone cliffs block expansion in multiple directions. The city feels trapped within its own geography. And because players can clearly see those boundaries, every occupied building feels more significant. Every home suggests another family competing for space. The city appears full because there are visible limits preventing it from becoming anything else. The Silverblood family's influence also contributes indirectly to this atmosphere. Mining operations dominate much of the local economy, drawing workers and activity into an already constrained city. Markarth functions as one of Skyrim's most important industrial centres, which naturally increases the concentration of labourers, merchants, guards, and associated residents. Economic activity becomes centralised, population becomes centralised, everything becomes concentrated, and concentration creates density. Compared to other cities, Markarth often feels like a pressure cooker. Whiterun benefits from open fields and broad roads. Solitude sits atop a massive arch with more generous public spaces. Windhelm, despite its density, still contains wider courtyards and larger avenues. Markarth offers very little relief. The architecture constantly presses inward. Stone dominates every view, buildings crowd against one another. Pathways remain narrow. The city feels physically incapable of relaxing. That tension subtly affects how players perceive the population. Every small group of NPCs can make an area feel crowded when the environment itself feels restrictive. The city's numerous internal conflicts amplify this sensation further. Guards monitor the streets, political tensions simmer beneath the surface. The Forsworn influence local affairs, criminal activity emerges throughout the city. All of these elements generate movement and interaction. People gather, people argue, people investigate. The city feels socially active because so many different groups are operating within the same confined environment. Again, this doesn't necessarily increase the actual population. It increases the perception of population. And perception matters far more when discussing how crowded a city feels. One of the most interesting aspects of Markarth is that the city never truly allows players to escape the presence of other people. In many Skyrim settlements, it's easy to find quieter corners away from the main population. Markarth struggles to provide those spaces. Even residential districts often overlook busy pathways. Public buildings connect directly to commercial zones. The city layers activity vertically rather than separating it geographically. As a result, the population always feels close, always present, always sharing the same limited space. That proximity creates an almost claustrophobic quality unique among Skyrim's major cities. Even the city's visual design reinforces the illusion of density. Looking upward reveals additional buildings, stairways, balconies, and terraces stacked above one another. Looking downward reveals the exact same thing. Every direction contains evidence of habitation. Every direction contains people. The city appears full because players can literally see multiple layers of the population at the same time. Few other locations in Skyrim create that effect. That's ultimately what makes Smartkarth one of the most overpopulated places in the entire game. Not because it contains dramatically more NPCs than other cities, not because it serves as Skyrim's largest settlement, but because every aspect of its design forces people into close proximity. The canyon restricts expansion, the architecture encourages vertical stacking, the economy centralizes activity, the pathways funnel movement. Everything works together to create the sensation of a city operating at the limits of its available space. A population compressed between ancient stone walls, a community layered on top of itself, and a city where every staircase, terrace, and narrow pathway reminds you that there simply isn't anywhere else for anyone to go. Riften is one of the most overpopulated cities in all of Skyrim, but not because it's overflowing with ordinary citizens. What makes Riften feel crowded is the sheer number of competing interests, criminal operations, corrupt officials, desperate residents, merchants, thieves, mercenaries, and opportunists, all packed into a relatively small city. Unlike places such as Solitude, where authority dominates daily life, or Whiterun, where trade and agriculture shape the city's identity, Riften often feels as though crime itself has become part of the population. The city isn't just inhabited by people, it feels inhabited by schemes, conspiracies, and illegal activities. Everywhere the player goes, there seems to be another person trying to manipulate someone, steal from someone, extort someone, threaten them, or profit from someone else's misfortune. The result is a city that feels far busier than its actual size would suggest, creating a unique form of overcrowding built not on numbers, but on constant criminal activity. The moment players first arrive in Riften, that atmosphere becomes obvious. Unlike many cities in Skyrim that ease players into their local culture, Riften introduces itself through crime almost immediately. Before you've even had time to properly explore, you're likely witnessing arguments, hearing rumours about thefts, or becoming involved in one of the city's countless scams or schemes. The city doesn't wait to reveal its problems. It practically advertises them. That immediate exposure creates the impression that everyone in Riften is connected to something questionable. And in many cases, they are. The city's layout contributes heavily to this feeling. Riften is one of Skyrim's more compact major cities. While it contains important buildings, businesses, and residential areas, much of the city is concentrated around a relatively small central marketplace and surrounding streets. That means people constantly cross paths. Merchants interact with thieves, citizens interact with guards, criminals interact with victims. Everyone occupies the same limited space, much like Markarth. Unlike larger cities where different social groups can spread out across separate districts, Riften forces all of its activity into close proximity. The result is a city that rarely feels calm. Something is always happening, someone is always plotting something, and because those interactions happen so close together, the city feels crowded with criminal energy. The Thieves' Guild plays an enormous role in creating this atmosphere. Most cities in Skyrim contain criminal elements, but few are as thoroughly influenced by organised crime as Riften. The Guild's presence extends far beyond the ragged flagon hidden beneath the city. Their influence affects businesses, politics, trade, and even ordinary citizens' daily lives. Whether people openly acknowledge it or not, the Guild exists as an invisible population layer underneath the city's official one. Every merchant potentially owes someone money. Every guard potentially knows more than they admit. Every business owner potentially operates under pressure. The player constantly encounters evidence of this hidden network. And because the guild's influence touches so many different people, it feels as though the city contains far more inhabitants than it physically does. Crime becomes a kind of population in its own right. The Blackbriar family amplify this sensation even further. In many cities, power is distributed among various nobles, officials, and institutions. Riften often feels dominated by a single family whose influence stretches into nearly every corner of civic life. Maven Blackbriar's reach extends through businesses, guards, politics, and criminal organisations simultaneously. That concentration of power creates a city where multiple systems overlap constantly. Legitimate authority bends with criminal authority. Public business blends with private intimidation. Legal transactions blend with corruption. The result is a city where every conversation seems connected to some larger network of influence. And when every person appears tied to someone else's scheme, the city naturally feels crowded, not physically, socially. Riften's marketplace provides one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. Most marketplaces in Skyrim function primarily as commercial centres. People buy and sell goods, exchange information, and move on with their day. Riften's market feels different. Every stall seems connected to a story. Every merchant has problems. Every customer has concerns. Every conversation hints at some hidden tension. The market doesn't simply facilitate trade, it facilitates conflict. And conflict ultimately creates activity. And the more activity a city contains, the more populated it can feel. That effect becomes even stronger because so many of Riften's NPCs are memorable. Cities often feel larger when their residents leave strong impressions. Riften excels at this because so many of its inhabitants are directly involved in ongoing disputes, scams, rivalries, or criminal enterprises. Players remember these people, they remember their arguments, they remember their schemes, they remember their betrayals. As a result, the city's population feels larger than it actually is. A memorable citizen occupies more mental space than an ordinary one, and Riften is full of memorable citizens. The Ratway contributes significantly to this city's overpopulation as well. Most Skyrim cities exist primarily above ground. Riften effectively contains two overlapping settlements. There's the city everyone sees, and then there's the city underneath. The Ratway houses criminals, thieves, drifters, and people living outside normal society. Entire communities exist beneath the streets, creating the impression that Riften's population extends far beyond what is visible on the surface. This hidden layer makes the city feel crowded in a way very few settlements can match. Even when the streets appear relatively calm, players know there's an entire second world operating underneath them. That knowledge changes how the city feels. Every alley potentially leads somewhere dangerous, every building potentially hides secrets, every citizen potentially has connections below. The city never feels simple, and simplicity often creates the illusion of emptiness. Riften has the opposite problem. It feels overloaded. The guards reinforce this atmosphere constantly as well. In many cities, guards exist primarily as background figures, maintaining order until you do something wrong. Riften's guards often feel overwhelmed. Their dialogue repeatedly references corruption, crime, and problems they seem unable or unwilling to solve. That creates the impression that criminal activity exceeds the city's ability to contain it. And when crime feels larger than law enforcement, the city naturally feels overcrowded with wrongdoing. The legal system appears outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and surrounded. Even the city's physical appearance supports this interpretation. Riften's wooden architecture, narrow walkways, and close-packed buildings create a sense of compression similar to what Markarth achieves through vertically. People live close together, businesses operate close together, criminals operate in the same vicinity. Everything overlaps. There are very few truly isolated spaces, and as a result, problems spread quickly. Rumours spread and influence spreads as well. The city functions almost like a pressure chamber where every social issue becomes amplified by proximity. Compared to Whiterun, the contrast is striking. Whiterun contains plenty of residents, but much of the city feels open. Large public spaces separate different districts, the population spreads naturally across the settlement. Riften doesn't offer that luxury. The city feels packed. Every street seems occupied, every building seems involved in something. The concentration of criminal activity makes the city feel denser than it actually is. The prevalence of scams and manipulation further contributes to this atmosphere. In most Skyrim cities, players can interact with merchants and citizens without immediately becoming entangled in larger problems. Riften rarely allows that. Someone wants something, someone owes something, and someone is always hiding something. The player constantly becomes involved in local disputes because the city itself revolves around those disputes. It's almost impossible to remain a passive observer, and that constant involvement creates the sensation that there are more people competing for attention than the city can comfortably support. That's ultimately what makes Riften one of Skyrim's most overpopulated feeling places. Not because it contains the highest population, not because it's physically the largest city, but because every resident seems connected to multiple layers of activity at once. Crime overlaps with commerce, politics overlaps with corruption, business overlaps with extortion. The city feels crowded because everyone is participating in something. Every conversation leads to another problem. Every problem leads to another person, and every person ultimately leads to another scheme. The result is a settlement that feels perpetually overwhelmed by its own activity. A city where criminal influence spreads into every corner of daily life. A place where the population seems larger than the streets can actually contain. And a city where crime itself has become so widespread that it feels like an additional population living alongside everyone else. Nightgate Inn is one of the strangest examples of an overpopulated place in all of Skyrim because, on paper, it should feel completely isolated. Unlike the major cities packed with merchants, guards, nobles, and travellers, Nightgate Inn sits alone in the frozen wilderness of northern Skyrim. There are no surrounding villages, no nearby markets, no large roads packed with constant traffic. The landscape around it is defined by snow, mountains, forests, and long stretches of emptiness. If you were looking at a map, Nightgate Inn would seem like one of the last places in Skyrim that should ever feel crowded. And yet somehow it often ends up feeling far busier than settlements many times its size. That's because Nightgate Inn occupies a unique role within Skyrim's world design. It isn't merely a tavern, it acts almost like a magnet for wandering NPCs, random encounters, travellers, adventurers, mercenaries, nobles, and countless other characters moving throughout the province. The result is a location that often feels bizarrely overpopulated despite existing in one of the loneliest regions of the game. The first thing that makes Nightgate Inn stand out is its geography. Most inns in Skyrim are attached to something larger. The Benned Mare sits in the heart of Whiterun. The Winking Skeever serves as the bustling population of Solitude. Candlehearth Hall benefits from the constant activity of Windhelm. These establishments feel naturally busy because they're embedded within the major population centres. Nightgate Inn has no such advantage. It's essentially alone, surrounded by wilderness. The nearest signs of civilization are separated by long journeys across dangerous terrain. If realism were the only factor, Nightgate Inn should be empty most of the time. Instead, players frequently discover the opposite. The inn often feels strangely crowded. And that's what makes it such a fascinating location under the theme of overpopulated places. Because the crowding feels completely disconnected from the surrounding environment. You leave the inn and find miles of frozen emptiness. You enter the inn and suddenly encounter a collection of people that seems statistically impossible. Part of this comes from the way Skyrim handles travelling NPCs. The game constantly generates movement across the world. Merchants travel between cities, adventurers wander roads, bards journey from settlement to settlement, nobles move between important locations. Mercenaries, hunters, pilgrims, and countless other characters follow the same routines or encounter the same systems designed to make Skyrim feel alive. Many of those systems eventually funnel characters towards inns, and Nightgate Inn benefits from this more than most. Because there are so few alternatives nearby, the inn becomes a kind of oasis, not merely for the player, for the game world itself. Travelers crossing through the northern wilderness often end up there because there simply aren't many other places to go. That creates an unusual concentration of activity. The inn starts functioning less like a local tavern and more like a crossroad, a gathering point, a shelter. The only warm light visible for miles. That warmth is incredibly important when discussing why the inn feels so crowded. Skyrim's northern regions are among the harshest environments in the province. Snow blankets the landscape, temperatures feel perpetually cold, hostile wildlife roams the wilderness. Bandits occupy isolated ruins and roads. The environment constantly reminds players how difficult it is to survive in these conditions. Against that backdrop, Nightgate Inn becomes something more than just a business. It becomes a refuge. The glowing windows, roaring fireplace, food, beds, and human company stand in direct contrast to everything outside. And because of that contrast, every NPC inside feels significant. Every traveller seems understandable. Every occupied chair reinforces the feeling that people naturally gravitate towards warmth. The result is an inn that often feels full even when its actual population isn't especially large. The types of characters who gather there make the situation even stranger. Nightgate Inn regularly attracts an eclectic mix of individuals who would rarely share a space elsewhere. Orc warriors might be sitting near wandering nobles, bards might be performing for mercenaries, random travellers might share tables with adventurers returning from distant ruins. The combinations can become almost absurd. And that's part of the charm, because the inn feels like a convergence point for stories that would otherwise never intersect. Every person arrived from somewhere different, every person is heading somewhere different as well. Yet for one brief moment they all occupy the same room. That concentration of diversity creates the illusion of a much larger population than the inn could realistically support. It's not merely crowded, it's crowded with unusual people. And unusual people attract attention. The inn's relatively small size amplifies this effect tremendously. Nightgate Inn isn't a large establishment. The common room contains limited seating. The available floor space isn't particularly extensive. There aren't multiple sprawling halls to distribute patrons evenly. Everyone occupies the same central area. That means every additional NPC feels noticeable. In larger taverns, crowds can spread out naturally. At Nightgate Inn, they really can't. The room forces proximity, and proximity creates density. A handful of travellers can suddenly make the inn feel packed. Several groups arriving simultaneously can make it feel overflowing. Compared to the emptiness outside, the contrast becomes even more dramatic. The inn's role within Skyrim's random encounter systems also contributes heavily to its reputation. Players often arrive expecting solitude because of the location's remoteness. Instead, they discover a surprisingly active social space. That expectation gap matters. Crowds feel larger when they appear somewhere unexpected. A busy marketplace in Whiterun feels normal. A busy tavern in the middle of nowhere feels strange. Nightgate Inn benefits from that psychological effect constantly. The player expects isolation, the inn delivers company. The difference creates the impression of overpopulation. Even the architecture helps reinforce this sensation. The building feels cozy rather than spacious. Wooden walls, low ceilings, fireplaces, and compact furniture arrangements create a sense of intimacy. Everyone feels close together. Conversations overlap, NPCs move around one another constantly. The space wasn't designed for large gatherings, yet large gatherings frequently occupy there anyway. That mismatch between design and population is one of the primary reasons the inn feels so crowded. The building itself seems overwhelmed by the number of people using it at some points in time. The surrounding landscape makes this even more noticeable. Nightgate Inn isn't hidden within a dense cluster of attractions. The nearby region contains caves, ruins, roads, and wilderness, but none of them generate the sustained activity associated with major settlements. Most of the area feels empty. Travel through the region often involves long stretches without encountering anyone. Then suddenly, Nightgate Inn appears, and everyone seems to be there. The effect almost feels unnatural, like the entire northern population decided to gather in a single building. Compared to cities like Solitude or Riften, Nightgate Inn achieves population density through concentration rather than scale. Those cities feel crowded because they contain many residents spread across large areas. Nightgate Inn feels crowded because a surprisingly large number of people occupy a surprisingly small space. The distinction is important. One creates urban density, the other creates social density. And social density often feels more noticeable because players interact with it more. Every patron is only a few steps away, every conversation happens within earshot, every arrival changes the atmosphere immediately. The inn becomes a living demonstration of how population perception isn't always determined by numbers alone. Sometimes context matters more. And few locations benefit from context more than Nightgate Inn. The innkeeper and staff contribute subtly to this atmosphere as well. Their presence reinforces the idea that Nightgate Inn exists, specifically to serve travellers crossing dangerous territory. The establishment wasn't built to support a nearby community. It was built because people needed somewhere to stop. That purpose naturally attracts movement, and movement creates crowds, not permanent crowds, temporary ones. But temporary crowds can often feel more significant because they constantly change. Different travellers arrive, different travellers leave. The composition of the inn shifts repeatedly, yet the sense of activity remains. That's ultimately what makes Nightgate Inn feel like a very overpopulated place at some points in time in a Skyrim playthrough. Not because it contains hundreds of residents, not because it's physically large, but because it serves as a beacon in an otherwise empty region. The only warmth for miles, the only shelter for miles, the only gathering place. As a result, orc warriors, wandering nobles, mercenaries, bards, adventurers, and ordinary travellers all end up sharing the same tiny space. A collection of strangers brought together by geography, necessity, and circumstance, creating one of Skyrim's most unexpectedly crowded locations, a tavern standing alone in the frozen wilderness, and somehow feeling busier than entire cities. Another overpopulated place in Skyrim is the Ragged Flagon, not because it contains hundreds of people, but because it manages to cram an entire criminal organisation into one of the smallest faction headquarters in the game. Hidden beneath the streets of Riften, within the winding tunnels of the Ratway, the Ragged Flagon serves as the headquarters of the Thieves Guild, one of Skyrim's most famous factions. On paper, it should feel like a secret hideout occupied by a handful of criminals operating from the shadows. In practice, it often feels remarkably crowded. Guild members, fencers, merchants, recruits, quest givers, trainers, and various associates all occupy a surprisingly small space, creating an atmosphere where everyone seems to be living on top of one another. Unlike many faction headquarters that spread their members across large halls, castles, fortresses, or academies, the Ragged Flagon compresses nearly all of its activity into a cramped underground tavern connected to one of the most claustrophobic dungeon systems in Skyrim. The result is a location that constantly feels full, busy, and surprisingly overpopulated, despite being physically much smaller than almost every other major faction base in the province. The feeling begins long before players reach the Flagon. To get there, they must travel through the Ratway, and the Ratway itself plays a huge role in making the headquarters feel crowded. Unlike the broad roads of Skyrim's cities or the expansive halls of other organisations, the Ratway is a maze of narrow corridors, low ceilings, twisting tunnels, damp chambers, and confined passageways. Even when relatively few NPCs occupy these spaces, the environment creates the sense of compression. The walls seem close together, the tunnels rarely open into large rooms, visibly it's often limited. Everything feels cramped, everything feels enclosed. And because the Ratway acts as the gateway to the Thieves' Guild, that claustrophobic atmosphere carries directly into the player's perception of the faction itself. By the time you reach the Ragged Flagon, you've already spent several minutes moving through spaces that feel too small. Then the headquarters appear, and somehow it feels just as crowded. The Ragged Flagon's layout is one of the primary reasons for this sensation. Unlike many taverns in Skyrim, the Flagon wasn't originally designed as a gathering space for dozens of people. The central room contains tables, seating, a bar, walkways, and access points leading deeper into the guild's operations. But the available space remains surprisingly limited. Yet somehow nearly every important member of the organisation occupies it. Dalvin Mallory, Vex, Tornilia, Derridge, guild recruits, various members associated with quests and daily operations. Everyone shares the same relatively compact area. The result is a headquarters where important NPCs are rarely far apart. No matter where players stand, multiple guild members are usually within sight. That concentration creates the illusion of a much larger population than actually exists. The Thieves' Guild's structure contributes heavily to this feeling. Most major factions in Skyrim distribute their members throughout large facilities. The Companions are in Whiterun, within a spacious mead hall with sleeping quarters, training areas and surrounding grounds. The College of Winterhold possesses multiple towers, halls, classrooms, courtyards, and research spaces spread across an enormous complex. Even the Dark Brotherhood's sanctuary, despite being hidden, contains enough separate rooms to give members a sense of personal space. The Ragged Flagon offers almost none of that. Everyone gathers together, everyone works together, everyone occupies the same room. The headquarters feels less like a professional organisation and more like a group of people crowded into a basement. And that's exactly why it feels so populated. The comparison to the Companions is particularly revealing. The Companions often contain a similar number of notable NPCs. But Yovaskar rarely feels crowded because of its architecture. The building contains large communal spaces and high ceilings. Members can spread out naturally. The Ragged Flagon doesn't allow that. Its low ceilings and compact design force everyone into close proximity. A handful of people can suddenly make the room feel packed. The same number of NPCs occupying Yovaskar would feel comfortable. Inside the Flagon, they feel concentrated. The underground setting amplifies this sensation constantly. Human beings naturally associate underground environments with confinement. Caves, tunnels, and basements often feel smaller than equally sized spaces above ground because there are fewer visual escape routes. The Ragged Flagon benefits from this psychological effect. Even when players know the room isn't particularly tiny, the surrounding ratway makes it feel smaller. The headquarters exists beneath layers of stone, wood, and city infrastructure. There are no windows, no open skies, no expansive views. The entire faction operates within a hidden pocket underneath Riften. That isolation creates pressure, and pressure creates the perception of density. The ratway itself deserves additional attention because it functions almost like an extension of the headquarters. Unlike faction bases that sit comfortably within open environments, the Ragged Flagon remains connected to a sprawling network of narrow passages occupied by thieves, criminals, drifters, and various hostile inhabitants. The tunnel never feels spacious. Even after repeated visits, many players continue describing the ratway as maze-like and claustrophobic. The corridors twist unexpectedly, rooms connect awkwardly, the architecture feels improvised. That sense of spatial restriction influences how players perceive the headquarters. The Flagon doesn't feel like a destination. It feels like a room carved out of an already overcrowded underground world. Compared to the College of Winterhold, the difference is dramatic. The college sits on a massive cliff overlooking the Sea of Ghosts. Towers stretch into the sky, bridges connect separate wings of the complex. Even when students and mages gather together, the environment still feels open. The Ragged Flagon achieves the opposite effect. The ceilings feel lower, the walls feel closer, and the population feels larger. Not because there are more people, because there is less room. That's a crucial distinction when discussing overpopulation. Density often matters more than numbers, and the Ragged Flagon excels at creating that kind of density. The headquarters also gains additional inhabitants as the Thieves Guild questline progresses. New members return, businesses become associated with the guild, the organisation's influence expands throughout Skyrim. Interestingly, the headquarters doesn't expand much alongside that growth. The same space continues supporting more activity. The same room continues serving more functions. As the guild becomes stronger, the flagon often feels busier. Yet it never becomes larger. That imbalance reinforces the sensation that the faction is gradually outgrowing its own headquarters, something few other faction bases experience. The tavern aspect of the flagon further contributes to the atmosphere. Taverns naturally encourage gathering, much like the Bannered Mare. People sit together, conversations overlap, information spreads through social interaction. The Ragged Flagon combines that tavern energy with the operational needs of an entire criminal organisation. Business meetings happen beside casual conversations. Training discussions happen beside recruitment efforts. Merchants operate alongside thieves. Everything occurs simultaneously. The headquarters functions as a bar, office, marketplace, meeting hall, and faction base all at once. Naturally, that creates crowding. Every role competes for the same limited space. Even visually, the flagon emphasises population density. Tables fill much of the central area. Walkways circle around them, merchants occupy permanent positions, guild members stand close together, surrounded by a big lake in the middle. There are very few empty areas. The headquarters feels occupied from wall to wall. Compared to the Dark Brotherhood Sanctuary, this becomes especially noticeable. The sanctuary contains multiple chambers dedicated to specific purposes. Sleeping quarters remain separate from communal areas. Training spaces remain separate from gathering spaces as well. The Ragged Flagon doesn't have that luxury. Functions overlap consistently. Everyone shares the same environment. The result is a faction headquarters that feels active at all times. Perhaps the most important factor is that the Thieves Guild itself revolves around networking. Unlike warriors or mages, thieves depend heavily on communication. Information must move quickly. Plans must be coordinated, contacts must remain accessible. As a result, it actually makes sense for guild members to remain close together. The crowded headquarters reflects the faction's culture. Thieves need people. People need proximity. Proximity creates density. And density creates the perception of population. That's ultimately what makes the Ragged Flagon one of Skyrim's most overpopulated feeling places. Not because it contains more NPCs than every other faction base. Not because it's physically large. But because an entire guild operates from a remarkably small underground tavern connected to a maze of cramped tunnels. The Ratway feels narrow, the headquarters feel crowded, the members feel packed together. Compared to the grand halls of Yovaskar, the towering architecture of the College of Winterhold, or even the compartmentalized structure of the Dark Brotherhood, the Ragged Flagon feels almost suffocatingly dense. A criminal empire squeezed into a basement, a faction headquarters hidden beneath a city, and a place where every corner seems occupied by another thief, another merchant, or another guild member trying to fit into a place that seems far too small for all of them. Trevar's Watch is one of the most deceptively overpopulated locations in all of Skyrim because, unlike cities or inns that feel crowded due to large numbers of ordinary people, Trevar's Watch feels crowded because it is absolutely overflowing with hostile occupants. At first glance, the fort doesn't appear especially remarkable. Skyrim is filled with ruined forts, abandoned strongholds, and military outposts left behind by previous generations. Most of them contain a handful of bandits, a few guards, or small groups of enemies occupying isolated sections of the structure. This watch is different. The moment players begin exploring the fort, they quickly realize that nearly every corner of the location is occupied. Bandits seem to be everywhere. Guards patrol the walls, archers watch from elevated positions. Warriors occupy courtyards, and additional enemies fill the interior chambers beneath the fort. The result is a location that often feels far more densely populated than many of Skyrim's actual settlements, creating the strange impression that more people are living inside this hostile ruin than in some legitimate villages scattered across the province. The first reason this place feels so populated is its layout. Unlike many forts that spread enemies across large open areas, Trevar's Watch compresses its occupants into a relatively confined space. The fort itself isn't enormous by Skyrim standards. There are walls, towers, interior rooms, underground sections, and defensive positions, but everything exists within a limited footprint. That means enemies are constantly close together. As players move through the location, they rarely experience long periods without encountering someone. Clear one section and another group is already visible. Finish one battle and another enemy appears moments later. The fort creates a continuous sense of occupation, and occupation naturally translates into population density. The exterior immediately establishes this feeling. Many Skyrim dungeons begin with gradual build-up, allowing players to approach quietly before encountering resistance. Trevar's Watch rarely offers that luxury. Enemies occupy visible positions throughout the fortifications. Guards stand on walls, archers monitor entrances, patrols move through open areas. The player doesn't get the impression of discovering an abandoned ruin. They get the impression of approaching an active settlement. A hostile settlement, but a settlement nonetheless. The fort feels lived in not by civilians, but by bandits. And there are a lot of them. What makes this especially noticeable is that the bandits appear organised. Many enemy locations in Skyrim feel loosely occupied, with small groups sharing space without much indication of broader coordination. Trevar's Watch feels structured. Different enemies occupy different roles. Lookouts guard elevated positions, warriors control choke points, leaders maintain authority over key areas. The distribution of enemies create the impression of a functioning community rather than a temporary camp. That distraction is important because functioning communities feel larger than disorganized groups. The fort doesn't simply contain enemies, it feels populated by them. The interior sections amplify this dramatically. Once players move beyond the outer defences, the density often increases. Corridors connect occupied rooms, chambers contain additional patrols, storage areas, barracks, and defensive positions all house more enemies. The fort seems determined to fill every available space. This creates an unusual experience where the location constantly feels active. Even when no combat is occurring, the player remains aware that numerous enemies occupy nearby areas. That awareness creates psychological crowding. The fort feels full because players know people are everywhere. Many forts in Skyrim contain empty rooms or abandoned sections that create breathing room between encounters. Trevar's Watch rarely provides that relief. The population density remains consistently high. Another factor contributing to this sensation is the quest associated with the location. Unlike purely optional dungeons that players might stumble upon unexpectedly, Trevar's Watch comes with a narrative emphasizing its occupation. The fort isn't simply inhabited, it's been taken over. Its original owners have lost control. The people connected to the fort are actively trying to reclaim it. That context changes how players perceive the population inside. Every bandit isn't merely another enemy. They're part of a larger force controlling the entire structure. The fort feels crowded because the occupation feels complete. There aren't isolated pockets of resistance. The bandits dominate nearly everything. Compared to Skyrim's smaller settlements, the contrast can be surprising. Villages such as Kynes Grove, Dragon Bridge, or Shaw's Stone contain relatively small populations spread across multiple buildings. Trevar's Watch often contains a comparable number of occupants concentrated in a much tighter environment. The result is a fort that can feel more crowded than actual communities. And of course, the nature of those occupants change the atmosphere entirely. Instead of merchants and farmers, players encounter guards and raiders. Instead of conversations, they encounter combat. But population density doesn't necessarily require friendliness. A location can feel crowded because large number of people occupy it. Trevar's Watch demonstrates that perfectly. The architecture plays a major role in enhancing this effect. Forts naturally encourage concentration because defensive structures limit available space. Walls define boundaries, towers create vertical choke points, courtyards funnel movement. Everyone ends up sharing the same confined environment. In Trevar's Watch, that design works especially well because nearly every strategic location contains someone. The walls aren't empty, the towers aren't empty, the interior isn't empty. The underground sections aren't empty. Every layer of the fort contributes additional occupants. The player experiences population density vertically as well as horizontally. Enemies exist above, below, and around them simultaneously. The fort feels crowded from every direction. The constant combat further reinforces this perception. Human minds often associate activity with population. A busy city feels populated because people are constantly doing things. Trevar's Watch achieves a similar effect through combat encounters. Enemies react to the player's presence, reinforcements emerge from nearby rooms, archers provide support from elevated positions. The fort feels alive because its inhabitants actively respond to threats. That responsiveness creates the impression of a much larger population than the raw numbers alone might suggest. Every battle feels connected to another battle. Every enemy seems linked to a broader defensive network. The fort behaves like a community protecting itself, even though that community consists entirely of criminals. The underground section deserves special attention because they transform what initially appears to be a standard fort into something much larger. Many players expect the population density to decrease after clearing the exterior. Instead, additional enemies continue appearing. The fort keeps expanding, new rooms reveal new occupants, new corridors reveal new patrols. The experience becomes one of gradual realization. You begin to understand just how many people actually live there. And that realization contributes heavily to the fort's reputation for feeling crowded. Every time the player thinks they're nearing the end, more inhabitants appear. The population seems endless. Compared to locations like bandit camps or watchtowers, the difference becomes obvious. Smaller enemy locations often contain a handful of occupants serving a specific purpose. Trevar's Watch feels like an entire society. A criminal one, certainly, but also a society. People sleep there, guard there, store supplies there, organise, defend. The fort functions almost like a miniature city. One built around occupation and violence rather than commerce and governance. That's why the location often leaves such a strong impression. Players remember not only the combat but the sheer number of enemies involved. The fort feels packed. Every section reinforces the idea that this is a major stronghold rather than a temporary hideout. The concentration of occupations creates a sense of scale beyond what the physical structure alone could achieve. The fort seems larger because more people live there. The population creates the illusion of expansion, and that's what ultimately makes Trevar's Watch one of the most overpopulated locations in Skyrim. Not because it contains ordinary citizens, not because it's a major city, but because every available corner of the fort seems occupied. Walls crowded with guards, courtyards crowded with fighters, barracks crowded with inhabitants, tunnels also crowded with additional defenders. The entire structure feels saturated with life. Hostile life, criminal life, but life nonetheless. And by the time players finally clear the last room and defeat the final enemy, they often realise they've fought through a population that rivals some of Skyrim's legitimate settlements. A ruined fort transformed into a crowded stronghold, a military structure overflowing with occupants, and one of the clearest examples in Skyrim of how sheer enemy density can make a location feel more populated than an actual town. The Benned Mare is arguably one of the most populated inns in all of Skyrim, and what makes it stand out isn't simply the number of NPCs that pass through its doors, but the fact that it occupies one of the most important locations in the entire province, sitting just a short walk from Whiterun's bustling marketplace, directly within the walls of Skyrim's most centrally located city. The Benned Mare functions as far more than a simple tavern. It serves as a meeting place, a resting place, a social hub, a source of information, a recruitment centre, a gathering spot for travellers, and in many ways, the unofficial living room of Whiterun itself. While many inns throughout Skyrim rely on passing trade or isolated groups of locals, the Bennett Mare benefits from being positioned at the crossroads of nearly everything. Merchants, adventurers, guards, farmers, mercenaries, and ordinary citizens all eventually find themselves drawn towards the inn, creating one of the busiest and most consistently populated interiors in the entire game. The location alone explains much of its popularity. Whiterun occupies a unique position within Skyrim's geography. Situated near the centre of the province, it naturally attracts traffic from nearly every direction. Roads connect the city to Solitude, Windhelm, Markarth, Riften, Falkreath, and numerous smaller settlements scattered across the tundra. Long before players fully understand Skyrim's political landscape, they quickly realise that Whiterun serves as a kind of crossroads for the entire province. And wherever travellers gather, inns thrive. The Bennett Mare benefits from that reality more than perhaps any other tavern in Skyrim. Unlike remote inns that depend on occasional visitors, the Bennett Mare exists in a city where movement never really stops. People are always arriving, people are always leaving, and many of them eventually end up inside. The proximity to the marketplace amplifies this dramatically. Whiterun's market serves as one of the busiest commercial areas in the game. Merchants spend their days selling goods, farmers bring produce into the city, blacksmiths attract customers from throughout the region, and travellers frequently stop to buy supplies before continuing their journeys. The marketplace creates constant foot traffic, and the Bennett Mare sits only moments away. As a result, the inn feels connected to the daily rhythm of the city in a way very few other establishments do. People don't need a special reason to visit, they're already nearby. The inn becomes a natural extension of the market itself, a place where business continues after trading ends, a place where conversations continue after shopping is finished, a place where the city gathers. That role as a gathering place is crucial to understanding why the Bennett Mare feels so populated. Many Skyrim inns primarily serve travellers. The Bennett Mare serves travellers and locals simultaneously. Residents of Whiterun regularly visit, workers stop by after their shifts, guards spend time there. Adventurers use it as a base of operations, visitors from outside the city rent the rooms, and the inn attracts multiple populations at once. And when different groups occupy the same space, density naturally increases. What makes this particularly noticeable is the relatively compact size of the inn. The Bennett Mare isn't enormous. While it contains a respectable common room, several guest accommodations, and supporting facilities, it remains a single building serving an entire city. That means people inevitably gather close together. Conversations overlap, NPC schedules intersect, patrons share tables and floor space. The result is an atmosphere that often feels genuinely crowded. Not because Skyrim's engine allows hundreds of characters to appear simultaneously, but because the space itself encourages concentration. A dozen people inside the Bennett Mare can feel like far more. There's not much space to move around, especially compared to the emptier taverns scattered throughout the province. The variety of characters passing through the inn contributes heavily to this impression. One of the reasons the Bennett Mare feels alive is that its population rarely feels repetitive. Adventurers discuss their travels, mercenaries seek employment, citizens share rumours. Travellers rest between journeys, bards perform for audiences drawn from every corner of Skyrim. Each visitor brings a different story, each visitor serves a different purpose. The inn feels populated not merely by bodies, but by personalities. That distinction matters because memorable characters make locations feel larger. The Bennett Mare contains some of the most recognisable NPC interactions in Whiterun. Players remember conversations that occur there, they remember quests that begin, they remember companions they can recruit. As a result, the inn occupies a disproportionately large space in many players' memories. It feels bigger than it physically is, and population contributes heavily to that effect. The inn's connection to adventurers is especially important. Whiterun often functions as the player's first major city. Countless journeys begin there, countless journeys end. Naturally, the Bennett Mare becomes associated with those journeys. It serves as a meeting point for people seeking work, information, and companionship. Characters like Uthgerd the Unbroken reinforce this reputation, turning the inn into more than a place to eat and sleep. It becomes a location where opportunities emerge, and locations offering opportunities naturally attract people. The city's political importance also contributes to the inn's crowded atmosphere. Whiterun occupies a central role in Skyrim's Civil War storyline. Jarls, guards, messengers, soldiers, merchants, and travellers all pass through the city because of its strategic significance. Not all of those individuals visit the Bennett Mare directly, but their presence increases overall activity throughout the city, and increased activity inevitably spills into the inn. The Bennett Mare benefits from everything happening around it: trade, politics, adventure, conflict. All roads eventually seem to lead toward the common room. Compared to inns located in more isolated settlements, the difference becomes obvious. Consider establishments like Nightgate Inn. Despite attracting a surprising number of travellers, Nightgate Inn remains dependent on geography necessity. The Bennett Mare doesn't rely on that necessity. It relies on opportunity. People visit because they want to, not because they have no alternative. That distinction creates a very different kind of crowd. Nightgate gathers whoever happens to be passing through. The Bennett Mare gathers everyone: locals, visitors, merchants, warriors, nobles, labourers. The inn serves as a social crossroads rather than a geographic one. Even the physical design encourages interaction. Unlike some larger inns where patrons can spread out across multiple rooms, much of the Bennett Mare's activity centres around a shared common area. People remain visible to one another. Conversations occur within earshot. The fireplace serves as a focal point. The bar draws traffic continuously. Everything about the layout pushes characters together. And when people occupy shared spaces, these spaces feel crowded. The innkeeper, Holder, plays an understated role in the atmosphere as well. Her establishment feels welcoming and stable, qualities that encourage repeated visits from both NPCs and players. The Bennett Mare doesn't feel like a temporary stop. It feels permanent, reliable, established. People trust it, and trusted businesses attract customers. Over time, that reputation becomes self-reinforcing. More visitors create more activity. More activity attracts more visitors. The inn gradually becomes one of the most socially important locations in the entire city. Over time, that reputation becomes self-reinforcing. That constant flow of rumours and information further enhances its population density. Inns throughout Skyrim serve as information networks, but the Bennett Mare excels because of Whiterun's position at the heart of the province. News arrives there quickly, stories spread there, travellers exchange information there constantly. The inn becomes a communication hub, and communication hubs naturally can attract people. Everyone wants to know what's happening, everyone wants to be heard, and everyone wants to listen. The result is an establishment that actually feels active, even during quieter hours. Perhaps the most significant factor is that the Bennett Mare feels populated throughout the entire game. Many locations experience peaks and valleys depending on quest progression. The Bennett Mare remains relevant from beginning to end. Players visit early, players visit often. NPCs continue using it regardless of larger events. The inn never loses its role within Skyrim's ecosystem. That consistency creates the impression of a location operating at full capacity almost all the time. That's ultimately what makes the Bennett Mare one of the most populated places in all of Skyrim. Not because it contains the highest number of NPCs at any given moment, not because it's physically the largest inn, but because it occupies the perfect location. A short walk from the marketplace, a short walk from the city centre, and a short walk from nearly everything important happening in Whiterun. The city gathers around it, travellers gather within it. Stories begin there, journeys end there, and over time, the Bennett Mare becomes exactly what every great tavern aspires to be. The place where everyone eventually shows up. Not every place in Skyrim feels overpopulated because it contains a city full of citizens. or an inn packed with travelers. Sometimes a location can feel crowded because it has been completely overwhelmed by hostile occupants, to the point where the original purpose of the area is almost forgotten. Colsega Mine is one of the best examples of this. Located in the Reach, the mine should be a relatively straightforward mining operation, one of many scattered throughout Skyrim's rugged landscape. Instead, it has become infamous for feeling utterly overrun. The moment players approach the area, they quickly realise that this isn't a simple mine with a few enemies guarding the entrance. It feels like an entire Forsworn war camp, disguised as a mining settlement. Forsworn occupy the exterior, the approaches, the surrounding terrain, and the tunnels beneath the mine itself. Their presence is so extensive that the original miners have effectively vanished from the location, leaving behind a place that feels less like a workplace and more like a heavily defended stronghold packed with hostile inhabitants. What makes Colsega Mine particularly memorable is the way it introduces players to that occupation. Unlike many enemy locations where threats become visible immediately, Colsega Mine often catches players off guard. The surrounding landscape creates a false sense of security. The mine sits within a valley surrounded by rocky terrain and flowing water, appearing at first glance like a relatively ordinary settlement. Then the arrows start flying, and suddenly the player realizes just how many enemies are actually present. The ambush is one of the most effective in Skyrim because it reveals the true scale of the occupation all at once. Forsworn emerge from elevated positions, hidden pathways, defensive locations, and nearby structures. What initially looked like a small group rapidly turns into a much larger force. The location feels crowded because the players rarely gets to fight enemies one at a time. Instead, the Forsworn seem to attack from everywhere. That sensation of being surrounded plays a huge role in making the mine feel overpopulated. Population density is often measured by how many people occupy a space. Perceived population density is often measured by how many people can threaten you simultaneously. Colsega Mine excels at creating the latter. The exterior alone contains enough Forsworn to make the area feel like a functioning settlement. Guards occupy strategic positions overlooking important routes. Warriors patrol areas. Archers make use of elevated terrain. The defenders don't feel randomly distributed. They feel organised. And organised groups often always feel larger than scattered individuals. The Forsworn appear to control the entire area rather than merely inhabiting it. That distinction changes the atmosphere completely. The player isn't exploring a mine occupied by enemies. They're entering enemy territory. The geography of the Reach amplifies this sensation significantly. The Reach is already one of Skyrim's most hostile regions. Steep cliffs, narrow valleys, and difficult terrain naturally create opportunities for ambushes. Forsworn forces throughout the region frequently exploit these advantages. Colsega Mine benefits from all of them. Approaching the mine often means moving through terrain that limits visibility. Enemies positioned on higher ground gain significant tactical advantages. Players can find themselves under attack before they've even identified where the threats are coming from. As more Forsworn emerge, the location starts feeling increasingly crowded, not because the enemies are physically packed together, but because they control so much of the surrounding environment. The occupation extends beyond the mine itself. It spills into the landscape. That creates a larger sense of population than the actual numbers might suggest. The story behind the location reinforces this feeling perfectly. Colsega Mine wasn't abandoned naturally, it was taken. The miners didn't leave because the gold ran out, they were driven out. That context matters because it means every Forsworn encountered there represents someone actively replacing the previous population. The mine hasn't become empty, it's undergone a population transfer. The original workers are gone, the Forsworn are everywhere, and as a result, the location constantly feels inhabited. Not by the people who belong there, by the people who conquered it. This idea becomes even more apparent once the players enter the mine itself. Many Skyrim dungeons create a clear separation between exterior and interior populations. Defeat the guards outside and the density often decreases as exploration continues. Colsega Mine largely avoids that pattern. The interior remains heavily occupied, Additional Forsworn populate tunnels, chambers, and mining areas beneath the surface. The player quickly realizes that the enemies outside represented only part of the overall force. The occupation runs deep, literally. Every section of the mine seems to contain more inhabitants. Every tunnel reveals additional defenders. The feeling of overcrowding intensifies rather than diminishes. That's one reason the location leaves such a strong impression on many players. The mine feels saturated with enemies. There are very few moments where the player experiences genuine solitude. Someone is usually nearby, watching, waiting, preparing to attack. Compared to ordinary mines throughout Skyrim, the contrast is dramatic. Many mining locations contain a handful of workers, perhaps a few guards, and limited activity. Colsega Mine contains enough Forsworn to rival small settlements. The hostile population often feels larger than the original workforce probably was. That's an important observation because it highlights why the location feels overrun rather than merely occupied. An occupation suggests replacement. An overrunning suggests excess. The Forsworn presence exceeds what players expect the location should reasonably support. The mine feels overwhelmed by its own inhabitants. The Forsworn themselves contribute significantly to this perception because of how they operate. Unlike bandits who often appear disorganized and opportunistic, the Forsworn project a sense of collective identity. Their equipment, their tactics, and cultural taste creates the impression of a unified force. Every individual feels connected to a large community. As a result, encountering multiple Forsworn in one location creates the sensation of encountering an entire society rather than a collection of random enemies. Colsega Mine feels crowded because it contains representatives of a broader movement. The occupation feels purposeful, intentional, permanent. That permanence distinguishes the mine from countless other enemy locations. The visual design reinforces the idea constantly. Forsworn decorations, camps, defensive positions, and signs of habitation appear throughout the area. The location doesn't look like a temporary hideout. It looks claimed. The original identity of the mine gradually disappears beneath evidence of the new occupants. Every campfire suggests additional inhabitants. Every defensive position suggests additional defenders. The mine begins feeling less like a workplace and more like a community. A dangerous one at that. Comparisons with locations such as Trevar's Watch reveal an interesting difference. Trevar's Watch feels crowded because enemies fill nearly every available room within a confined fort. Colsega Mine feels crowded because enemies control both the location and the surrounding territory. The population extends outward, the influence also extends outward. The occupation feels larger than the physical boundaries of the mine. That creates a broader sense of density. Players aren't simply fighting through a building, they're fighting through a region. The infamous ambush near the entrance encapsulates everything that makes the location memorable. In a matter of seconds, what initially appears to be a manageable encounter can transform into chaos. Arrows rain down from elevated positions. Additional enemies emerge from unexpected directions. The player suddenly becomes aware of just how many Forsworn are operating nearby. The experience creates an immediate perception of overwhelming numbers. Whether the enemy count is objectively huge becomes almost irrelevant. The location feels packed, and perception often matters more than statistics. That's ultimately what makes Colsega Mine one of the most overpopulated feeling places in Skyrim. Not because it contains a bustling civilian population, not because it functions as a major city, but because it creates the constant impression that hostile occupants are everywhere. The Forsworn dominate the approaches, they dominate the exterior, they dominate the tunnels, they dominate the surrounding landscape. The original miners have become an afterthought. The mine itself has become secondary. What players remember is the occupation. That feeling of walking into a place that has been completely consumed by a hostile force. A gold mine transformed into a Forsworn stronghold. A workplace transformed into a battlefield. And one of the clearest examples in Skyrim of how a relentless enemy presence can make a location feel utterly overrun. Morthal is one of Skyrim's strangest settlements. Built on a swamp, it feels detached from the rest of the province. Traders rarely visit, The weather is endlessly damp and its people are withdrawn and suspicious. Unlike the bustling Whiterun or wealthy Solitude, Morthal seems to exist in a haze of decay. But Morthal's atmosphere isn't just the product of its location. Its story is shaped by the presence of something far darker. A vampire's lair, a cavern infested with vampires, led by the ancient and powerful Movarth. The lair looms over Morthal's existence like a storm cloud. The vampires that nest there directly prey upon the town, feeding on its people, spreading fear and keeping the settlement locked in a cycle of despair. In many ways, Morthal is Skyrim's most overrun city, not by bandits, not by war, but by a hidden infestation of vampires that ultimately changed the shape of an entire community. To understand why Morthal is overrun, one must first understand Movarth himself. Movarth is not an ordinary vampire. Once a mortal man, he dedicated his life to hunting vampires, studying their habits and weaknesses. But his obsession turned against him. Eventually, he was turned into the very monster he once sought to destroy. In some accounts, this transformation was deliberate, the result of his thirst for knowledge overwhelming his humanity. Unlike feral vampires who live in caves, Movarth retained his intelligence. He became a vampire of immense power, gathering thralls, servants, and followers to him. His lair became not just a hideout, but a colony, a hive of vampiric corruption that spread into the surrounding lands. And those surrounding lands just happened to include Morthal. Morthal is uniquely vulnerable to vampires. Its geography isolates it from Skyrim's centres of power. Built on a swamp, the settlement is shrouded in mist. Its paths half-sunken, and its economy stagnant. It has no strong walls, no bustling trade, and no loyal military to defend it. For a vampire like Movarth, this made Morthal the perfect feeding ground. The townsfolk are poor, desperate, and distrustful of outsiders. They live quiet lives, which means disappearances are less likely to draw attention from Jarls or soldiers elsewhere. In essence, Morthal is defenseless. The swamp itself also aids the vampires. Fog cloaks their movement and their isolation ensures that no reinforcements will ever come. Morthal is not like Solitude, with its imperial garrison, or Whiterun, with its central position in the province. It is a place abandoned by the wider world, and into that abandonment, Movarth slithered. The main questline tied to Morthal begins with tragedy. The suspicious burning of a house. Rogar's wife and a child perish in the blaze, leaving only questions. The Jarl of Morthal suspects foul play. Whispers suggest that Rogar himself may have been involved, enthralled by a dark power. And indeed, that dark power is Movarth's. Through thralls and manipulation, Movarth extends his control into the very heart of Morthal. Rogar's betrayal of his family is not just an act of cruelty, it is evidence of the vampire's ability to worm into mortal lives, to corrupt even the bonds of kinship. The fire is a turning point for Morthal. It is no longer simply a poor, isolated town. It becomes a hunting ground where even loved ones cannot be trusted. Movarth's shadow sweeps every corner, and the town begins to unravel. Movarth's lair is more than a cave. It is a fortress of despair. Found just northeast of Morthal, it is filled with thralls, vampires, and signs of prolonged habitation. Unlike many random vampire dens scattered across Skyrim, this one feels alive, a hive rather than a hideout. Inside, cages hold victims awaiting their fate. Coffins line the walls filled with resting predators. The lair is not just a place to sleep, it is an entire vampiric ecosystem. Movarth's followers live, hunt, and expand from within, treating the surrounding swamp as their territory. This is why Morthal as a city feels overrun. While other towns deal with the occasional vampire attack, Morthal is pressed against a fully functioning vampire colony. The lair is not abandoned ruins, it is an active infestation. Jarl Ravencrone is one of Skyrim's strangest rulers, a mystique who claims to see visions. She is often dismissed as eccentric or detached, but her rule over Morthal is shaped by the constant threat of Movarth's lair. Her people doubt her. They whisper that she ignores their suffering, that she is too wrapped up in prophecy to lead effectively. Yet her visions often point to the truth. Movarth is the source of the town's curse. Still, the tension remains. The Jarl can see what plagues Morthal, but she lacks the military strength to confront it. Without the Dragonborn, the lair might never have been destroyed. In this way, Idgrod's leadership reflects Morthal itself, insightful but powerless. Again, to understand why Morthal feels like Skyrim's most overrun city, one only needs to look at the daily lives of its people. Fear shapes everything. Families keep their children indoors. Travel after dark is unthinkable, and neighbours side-eye one another wondering who might be enthralled next. Every stranger could be a predator in disguise. This atmosphere of suspicion and dread isolates the town even further. Merchants avoid it, caravans rarely stop, even other Jarls pay little attention to Morthal's struggles. To outsiders, it is simply a backwater. To those inside, it is a town under siege not by armies, but by shadows. The Dragonborn's role in Morthal is pivotal. When tasked by the Jarl to investigate the fire, the hero uncovers Morvarth's influence, fights through the lair, and ultimately slays the vampire lord. This act saves Morthal, or at least temporarily. The thralls are freed or killed, the lair is emptied, and the town can breathe once again. But even in victory, the curse lingers. Vampires are not gone from Skyrim. New threats may rise, and the scars Morvarth left on Morthal will not fade easily. The Dragonborn's intervention highlights just how overrun Morthal was. Unlike other towns which might endure bandit raids or political struggles, Morthal could not survive without outside help. Its very survival depended on the intervention of a chosen hero. Skyrim is filled with dangerous dungeons. Felglow Keep with its mages, Blackreach with its horrors, or Bleak Falls Barrow with its dragger. Yet few of these places directly impact a town the way Morvarth's lair impacts Morthal. That proximity makes Morthal feel cursed and overrun, in a way no other city does. Imagine if Whiterun had a vampire nest just outside its gates, feeding on its citizens unchecked. The city would never be the same. And for Morthal, this is just reality. This is what makes the case so curious. Bethesda deliberately tied a major vampire lair to one of Skyrim's strangest towns, ensuring that its identity is inseparable from the horror festering just beyond its borders. Even after Movarth is slain, Morthal remains the same isolated, misty and uncertain place we all know it to be. The lair can be cleared, but its curse feels permanent. The swamp will always be there, the distrust will always linger, and the memory of Movarth will always haunt the people who lived under his shadow. This is the curious case of Skyrim's most overrun city, a town where the enemy was not seen in broad daylight, but in whispers, shadows, and fires that consumed families. Morthal may stand, but it will forever carry the scars of Movarth's reign. Skyrim's mines are supposed to be a place of work. Simple, practical spaces where people dig, gather resources, and move on. But that's not always what they become, because beneath the surface, far away from cities and guards, these places are vulnerable, easy to take over, easy to forget. And once something moves in, it rarely leaves. Spiders nest in the dark corners, Falmer carve out entire underground networks, and bandits can turn work sites into hideouts. What was once built for survival slowly becomes something else entirely. Something hostile, something claimed. And the deeper you go, the more it feels like these mines don't belong to Skyrim's people anymore. They belong to whatever got there first and refused to leave. Bile Gulch Mine is one of the clearest examples in Skyrim of how a place designed for simple, practical use can be completely overtaken and redefined by whatever decides to settle inside it, turning something ordinary into something controlled, hostile, and entirely removed from its original purpose. Located in the rocky tundra between Falkreath and Markarth, it doesn't stand out at first glance. It looks like any other mine scattered across the province. A small operation carved out into the landscape, with a few buildings signifying what is infesting there. This place is likely intended for resource gathering, quiet labour and steady output. But the moment you approach it, that expectation immediately starts to fall apart. Because Bile Gulch Mine isn't functioning as a mine anymore. It's a functioning stronghold. And more specifically, it's been claimed by a group of orc bandits who have turned the entire space into something far more structured and territorial than your typical roadside hideout. This isn't a temporary occupation or a loose gathering of enemies. It feels deliberate, reinforced, almost organised in a way that reflects orc stronghold culture, but twisted into something more aggressive and exclusionary. The exterior alone gives that impression. Barricades, watch positions, and a clear sense of control over the surrounding area makes it obvious that this isn't just a place they're hiding. It's a place they're defending. And that distinction is important because it changes how the mine is perceived. It's no longer just a location with enemies in it. It's territory, something that has been taken, reshaped, and now exists under entirely different rules than it was originally built for. Once you move inside, that feeling only intensifies. The mine's layout, like many others in Skyrim, is relatively straightforward, but the presence of the orc bandits transforms how it's experienced. Every corridor feels occupied, every open space feels watched. And the deeper you go, the more it becomes clear that this place has been adapted to support those living within it. There's a sense of permanence to it, as if this isn't just a temporary raid site, but a long-term base of operations. And that permanence is what makes it feel truly infested. Because infestation in this context isn't just about enemies being present, it's about replacement. The original function of the space has been completely overwritten. Whatever mining operation once existed here is irrelevant. The tools, the layout, the structure, all of it has been repurposed to serve something else. And that something else is control. The orc bandits don't just occupy this mine, they define it. Their presence dictates how the space functions, how it's navigated, and how it's perceived. There's no trace of its previous identity left in any meaningful way. And that transformation is what sets it apart from other infested locations. In many mines across Skyrim, you'll see remnants of their original purpose. Miners' belongings, partially used equipments, signs of a recent disruption. In Bile Gulch Mine, that sense of transition is largely gone. It doesn't feel like something that was recently taken over. It feels like something that has already been claimed and settled, with no intention of returning to what it once was. The orc presence also adds a unique layer to this idea, because unlike creatures like Falmer or spiders, who are often portrayed as inherently tied to the environments they inhabit, orcs bring with them a cultural identity. Their strongholds in Skyrim are structured, hierarchical, and bound by specific traditions. Bile Gulch Mine reflects a distorted version of that. It has the structure, the sense of hierarchy, the defensive mindset, but without the legitimacy or recognition of an official stronghold. It's what happens when that culture is removed from its proper context and forced into a space that wasn't meant for it at all. And that creates a kind of tension within the location. It feels organised but not stable, controlled but not really legitimate. Like something that exists on the edge of Skyrim's social structure, acknowledged only as a problem to be dealt with rather than a place to be understood. This ties into the broader idea of infestation as something that exists outside of the accepted systems of the world. Bile Gulch Mine isn't part of any hold's infrastructure. It doesn't contribute resources, doesn't support a settlement, doesn't serve any purpose beyond sustaining those who have taken over it. It's isolated, self-contained, and entirely disconnected from the systems that define the rest of Skyrim. And that isolation reinforces that feeling that this is something that has ultimately slipped through the cracks. A place that once lost is simply written off rather than reclaimed. Solion's sinkhole is a place where the player ultimately gets surprised by what has overtaken it, feeling like an intrusion from something ancient, something that was already there long before the mine existed, waiting beneath the surface. Located in the Reach just north of Old Roldan Inn, it begins like many other mining operations in the province. A small, functional site carved into the landscape, built with a clear purpose and supported by workers trying to make a living. There's nothing outwardly unusual about it at first. It's modest, grounded, entirely tied to the present. But that sense soon quickly starts to unravel the moment you step inside. Because what defines the sinkhole isn't what the miners built, it's what they uncovered. Unlike other mines that are taken over by bandits or creatures moving in from the outside, this is a case where the danger comes from below, from something buried and undisturbed until the act of mining itself brings it to the surface. The deeper sections of the mine reveal Nordic ruins, and with them the presence of Draga, not as scattered enemies but as a reawakening force tied to the ancient dead. This changes the entire framing of the location. The mine wasn't simply lost or abandoned, it was disrupted. The miners didn't fail to defend it, they accidentally unearthed something they were never meant to find. And once that line was crossed, there was no reclaiming it without confrontation of what had been awakened. What makes this especially effective is how the transition is handled. Much like Darkwater Pass, there isn't a single moment where everything changes. Instead, it's gradual. The mine begins to feel less like a place of work and more like a threshold. Wooden supports and mining equipment give way to stone architecture, carved walls and burial chambers that clearly belong to a much older world. And unlike Falmer tunnels which reshape and adapt, the Nordic ruin beneath Solion's sinkhole feels preserved, untouched until recently. The Draga aren't building anything new. I don't think they really could anyway. They're reclaiming what was always theirs. And that distinction creates a very different kind of tension. This isn't a place being transformed into something else. It's a place reverting back to what it once was, with the miners' presence reduced to a brief interruption in a much longer timeline. The Draga themselves reinforce this idea through their behaviour and placement. They aren't wandering aimlessly or occupying the mine in a disorganised way. They are positioned within the structure of the ruin, guarding it, moving through it with a sense of purpose that feels tied to something older than the current world. When they spill into the mine's upper sections, it doesn't feel like an expansion. It feels like a spillover, like a coffee that was poured too far over the brim of the mug, as if the boundary between the ancient and the present has been broken. And that's where the real unease comes from, because this place doesn't feel like it's been taken over by external force. It feels like it's been opened up to something that was always there, just waiting beneath the surface, much like the Falmer in Darkwater Pass. This also gives the location a different kind of narrative weight compared to the other overrun mines. In places like Bile Gulch Mine, the transformation is visible and immediate. A group takes control, reshapes the space, and establishes dominance. In Darkwater Pass, the change is environmental and systematic, a slow absorption into something alien. But in Solion's sinkhole, the change is temporal. It's about layers of history colliding. The mine represents the present, fragile and temporary, while the ruin beneath represents the past, enduring and unyielding. And when those two layers intersect, the result isn't coexistence, it's displacement. The present gives way to the past almost effortlessly. Even the structure of the mine supports this idea. It doesn't feel particularly deep or expansive at first, but once the ruin is revealed, the sense of scale shifts. The space beneath feels older, more significant, as if the mine was only ever scratching the surface of something much larger. And that imbalance makes the upper sections feel small in comparison, almost insignificant. The miners weren't uncovering a resource, They were uncovering a tomb, a piece of history that was never meant to be disturbed. And in doing so, they effectively erased their own claim to the space. The sinkhole ultimately stands out because it doesn't show a mine being lost. It shows how easily the present can be overwritten by the past in Skyrim. It's not about invasion or control, but about rediscovery in the worst possible sense. A reminder that much of the province is built on top of something older, something buried, and that digging too deep doesn't always lead to progress. Sometimes it just uncovers what was meant to stay hidden. And once that happens, the mine itself isn't just dangerous. It's no longer yours at all. Darkwater Pass doesn't feel like a place that was simply taken over. It feels like a place that was consumed slowly and completely, until whatever it used to be no longer mattered. Located near Darkwater Crossing and the Rift, it begins with a sense of being familiar. The entrance suggests a mine, or at least a very functional tunnel carved with purpose, something tied to the surface world and the people who live there. But that sense of normalcy doesn't last long. The deeper you move into Darkwater Pass, the more the environment shifts, not abruptly, but gradually, in a way that feels almost invasive. Wooden supports and man-made structures begin to give way to damp stone, bioluminescent growths, and the unmistakable signs of Falmer presence. It's not just that enemies appear, it's that the space itself begins to change identity. You're not entering a mine with Falmer in it, you're entering a Falmer domain that has absorbed a mine. That distinction is what defines Darkwater Pass, because the Falmer don't just occupy spaces, they reshape them. Their presence isn't surface level or temporary, it's systematic. The tunnels twist in ways that feel less engineered and more organic, as if the original layout has been altered over time to suit something else entirely. Charus nests line the walls, adding another layer of discomfort, not just visually, but conceptually as well. These creatures aren't just companions to the Falmer, they're part of the same ecosystem, reinforcing the idea that what's happening here isn't random. It's established, sustained, and deeply rooted. The further you go, the less it feels like you're exploring a location, and the more it feels like you're descending into something that has been building itself for a long time without interruption. What makes this especially effective is how subtle the transition is, creating a kind of overlap where it becomes difficult to separate what was built by humans and what has been altered by what came after. The blurring of boundaries is what gives Darkwater Pass its unsettling tone. It's not just a place that was lost, it's a place that was overwritten. The original purpose hasn't just been abandoned, it's been erased, replaced by something that doesn't resemble it in any meaningful way. Darkwater Pass doesn't feel temporary, it feels permanent, like whatever claim the surface once had over this space has been completely lost. It doesn't lead somewhere, it traps you within itself, looping you through a space that has no interest in connection back to the world above. It's a dead end in terms of purpose, but a fully realised system in terms of existence. Now that I've said all this, Darkwater Pass isn't technically a mine, and that's worth acknowledging, because on paper it doesn't belong in this category at all. It's a cave, separate from the structured, purpose-built spaces that define Skyrim's mining operations. But its inclusion here comes from something more contextual than literal. Because when you look at where Darkwater Pass is situated, right beside Darkwater Crossing, an active mining community, it starts to feel like an extension of that same industrial footprint. That kind of place that under slightly different circumstances would have been a mine. The geography lines up, the proximity makes sense. It sits close enough to a settlement built entirely around excavation that it's easy to imagine miners eventually pushing in that direction, expanding their operations, turning the cave into something functional. But that never happens, or more accurately, it can't happen, because whatever potential that space had is already gone, claimed long before it could be repurposed. The Falmer and Charles don't just occupy the cave, They preempt its future. They turn what could have been a site of productivity into something inaccessible, something hostile, something completely cut off from the world. And that's why it still fits here, not because it is a mine, but because it exists right on the edge of becoming one. A missed opportunity shaped entirely by what got there first and refused to leave. Infested before miners could find any sort of resources in there. Colsega Mine is another location where a mine being overrun feels less like random occupation and more like a deliberate act of reclamation, turning what should be a place of labour into something deeply tied to the conflict of the Reach itself. Located just east of Markarth, along the river that cuts through the Karth Valley, Colsega isn't some forgotten or insignificant site. It's a gold mine, valuable, productive, and directly tied to the wealth of the region. Or at least it used to be. By the time you arrive, that value hasn't disappeared, but it has been redirected, because the Forsworn who now occupy the mine haven't just stumbled upon it or taken shelter there. They've taken control of something that represents the very forces they oppose. At first glance, the structure of Colsega still reflects its original purpose. The exterior is open, active in design, with smelters, workstations, and clear signs of an organised mining activity. But that quickly gives way to something more hostile. Forsworn patrol the area, not as scattered enemies, but as a group that clearly understands the terrain and has positioned themselves to defend it. There's a sense of awareness to their presence. They aren't just hiding within the mine, they're asserting control over it and the surrounding land. And that control feels intentional in a way that sets Colsega apart from other locations, like Embashard Mine, where bandits simply take advantage of opportunity. The Forsworn aren't opportunists in the same way. They're ideological. Their presence here carries meaning. That meaning becomes clearer when you consider what Colsega Mine represents within the Reach. The region itself is defined by tension between the Nords who control it and the Forsworn who claim it as their ancestral land. Markarth stands as a symbol of that control, a city built on Dwemer foundations, rich in resources and heavily guarded. The mine, sitting just outside of it, feeds into that same system. It's part of the infrastructure that allows Markarth to thrive. So when the Forsworn take over the mine, it doesn't just disrupt a single location. It disrupts a supply line. It's a direct challenge to the authority that governs the region. Inside the mine, that tension continues to build. The deeper you go, the more it becomes clear that this isn't just a defensive occupation. It's an adaptation of the space itself. The Forsworn don't reshape the mine in the same way Falmer might, nor do they leave it structurally untouched like bandits often do. Instead, there's a blending of identities. The mine's layout remains intact, but its atmosphere shifts. The presence of the Forsworn, with their distinct armour, rituals, and connection to the land, creates a contrast against the industrial nature of the space entirely. It feels like two opposing ideas existing in the same place: extraction versus belonging. The mine was built to take from the land. The Forsworn, in their own way, are trying to reclaim it. This creates a unique kind of discomfort because Colsega Mine doesn't feel like it's being stripped of meaning. It feels like it has been given a different one. The gold is still there, the tunnels still function, but the purpose behind them has changed. It's no longer about production or profit. It's about control, resistance, and presence. The Forsworn aren't mining the gold in any structured sense, but by holding the mine, they're denying it to those who would. And that act alone transforms the space into something political. There's also a noticeable difference in how the location feels compared to the more enclosed or isolated mines. Colsega is relatively open, both outside and its inside sections. Sunlight reaches parts of it. The river runs nearby. It doesn't feel buried or hidden in the same way as other overrun locations. And that openness makes the takeover feel more bold. This isn't something happening in the shadows. It's happening in full view. right on the edge of one of Skyrim's most important cities. The Forsworn aren't concealing their presence, they're making it known. So Colsega Mine isn't just a place that was overrun, it's a place that was contested, taken and temporarily reclaimed, all within the broader struggle of the region it belongs to. It shows how a mine can become more than just a source of resources. It can become a symbol, a point of tension, a piece of land that means different things to different people. And because of that, its transformation feels more significant than a simple occupation. It's not just about who's inside the mine, it's about what the mine represents and who has the power to decide that. Embershard Mine is one of the first locations most players will ever encounter in Skyrim. And because of that, it's easy to overlook just how telling it is as an example of a mine being completely overrun and repurposed into something far removed from its original intent. Located just outside Helgen, along the road towards Riverwood, it sits directly in the path of your escape from the game's opening sequence. In many ways, it's designed to feel like a natural extension of the tutorial. A simple, approachable dungeon meant to introduce players to basic combat and exploration. But when you stop looking at it as a gameplay tool and instead consider what it represents within the world, Embershard Mine becomes something much more interesting. Because this isn't just a convenient early game encounter, it's a fully overtaken workplace sitting in one of the most trafficked areas in Skyrim, operating in plain sight. At a glance, Embershard still resembles what it once was. The structure is intact, the layout is clear, and there are still visible traces of its function as a mine. But almost immediately that illusion starts to break. The people inside aren't miners, they're bandits. They've wasted no time in turning the space into their own operation. Unlike more remote locations where takeovers can feel isolated or hidden, Embershard Mine exists right next to a major road, within walking distance of Riverwood and not far from Helgen itself. And yet, despite that proximity to civilization, it has been completely claimed by a hostile group with little resistance. That alone says a lot about how vulnerable these places are, especially in the aftermath of chaos like Helgen's destruction. Authority weakens and spaces like this are the first to fall. What makes Embershard stand out is how efficiently it has been repurposed. The bandits haven't just occupied the mine, they've adapted it to suit their needs almost seamlessly. Lookouts are positioned outside, keeping watch over the road. Inside, the layout is used strategically, with choke points, elevated positions and traps that suggest a level of awareness about how to defend a space. There's even a sense of routine to their presence. Conversations between bandits hint at a familiar nature, at a group that has settled in rather than just passing through. This isn't a temporary hideout, it's a functional base built on top of something that used to serve a completely different purpose. And yet, unlike places such as Bile Gulch Mine, there's no attempt here to establish identity or permanence beyond survival. The bandits aren't trying to build something new, they're simply using what's already there. The mine's infrastructure remains largely unchanged, but its meaning has shifted entirely. Where there was once labour and production, there is now control and opportunism. The tools, the tunnels, the storage areas, all of it has been recontextualised. The mine still functions in a way, but not for the people it was meant to serve. It's been hollowed out conceptually, its purpose replaced without altering its form. This creates an interesting contrast between appearance and reality. This mine looks familiar, almost mundane, especially compared to more dramatic locations in Skyrim. There are no ancient ruins hidden beneath it, no sprawling underground ecosystems, no overwhelming sense of scale. And because of that, it's easy to dismiss it as significant. But that simplicity is exactly what makes it effective. It shows how quickly and quietly a place can be overtaken without needing to be transformed into something unrecognizable. The change doesn't have to be dramatic to be complete. Sometimes all it takes is a shift in who controls the space. There's also something important about its placement so early in the game. Shard introduces players not just to combat, but to a recurring theme in Skyrim's world, that many of its structures are unstable, constantly shifting between ownership and abandonment. Mines, forts, caves, they don't stay under one group's control for long. They're contested, reclaimed, lost, repurposed over and over again. Shard Mine is simply the first time you see it happen, and because it's framed as a basic encounter, its implications are easy to miss. But in reality, it sets the tone for how the rest of the world has to operate. Even after clearing it, there's a lingering sense that nothing about the situation is permanent. The mine can be reclaimed, yes, but there's no guarantee it will stay that way. Another group could move in just as easily, and that instability is baked into the location, and to be honest, into the world of Skyrim itself. The mine doesn't present a resolved problem, it presents a cycle. In the end, what makes Shard Mine one of the most overrun mines and places in Skyrim isn't the scale of its takeover, but how ordinary it feels. There's no spectacle, no dramatic transformation, no hidden depth, just a straightforward example of how quickly something functional can become something hostile. And because it happens so early, so casually, it almost goes unnoticed. But it really shouldn't, because if a mine this close to civilization can be completely overtaken without much resistance, it raises a larger question about the rest of Skyrim. Not how these places fall, but how many of them were never truly secure to begin with. Mines in Skyrim are meant to be some of the most grounded places in the entire world. They're not ancient ruins or hidden cities, they're simply practical, built for one purpose, to work. But that's exactly what makes them so vulnerable. Because once that structure is broken, once the workers leave or something forces them out, these places don't stay empty for long. They get taken, sometimes by bandits looking for easy shelter, sometimes by something far worse lurking beneath the surface, and sometimes by forces that were already there, just waiting to be uncovered. What you're left with are spaces that feel familiar on the inside, but completely changed within. Not abandoned, but claimed. And across Skyrim, some mines stand out more than others, not for what they produce, but for what's taken over instead. What ultimately makes a place feel overpopulated in Skyrim isn't always the number of NPCs standing in a location at any given moment. More often, it's the feeling that the space is struggling to contain everything happening inside it. Some locations achieve this through sheer density, cramming dozens of people into a handful of streets, taverns, tunnels, or buildings. Others achieve it through constant activity, where merchants, travellers, guards, soldiers, thieves, and adventurers all compete for the same space and attention. That's why some of Skyrim's most crowded feeling places aren't necessarily its largest cities. A tiny village like Riverwood can feel bustling because so many important characters are packed into such a small area. An inn like the Bennett Mare or the Winking Skeever can feel packed because everyone eventually passes through their doors. The Ragged Flagon feels crowded because an entire criminal organisation operates from what is essentially an underground tavern, while places like Travar's Watch, Colseger Mine, and Blackreach create the same sensation through overwhelming enemy populations that seem to occupy every available corner. Then there are the cities like Solitude, where the feeling comes from its importance. Military activity, political influence, trade, culture, and constant movement all combine to create the impression of a city operating at full capacity. Everywhere you look, something is happening. Someone is arriving, or some large system is at work behind the scenes. And that's really the common thread connecting all of these places. They never feel empty. Whether it's a city, a cave, a fort, an inn, or an underground kingdom, these locations create the impression that there are more people, more stories, and more activity than the space should reasonably be able to hold. In a game famous for its vast wilderness and lonely roads, these are the rare places where Skyrim feels truly crowded. Places where every corner seems occupied, every building seems lived in, and every visit reminds you that sometimes the busiest locations aren't the biggest ones, but the ones where life has simply outgrown the space available.